A bank sent men to take a 71-year-old farmer's land in Oxfordshire. 3 generations worked that soil. Nobody local would raise a hand to stop it, but a stranger did. Wax jacket, battered Range Rover. A face nobody in that yard had placed yet. By 11 o'clock, the farm still belonged to the family. They say the stranger had a face half of Britain would know. Nobody in that yard will confirm it. Nobody has to. His name, in the version of the story that gets told, was Harold Beckwith. I should say plainly before we go any further that Harold Beckwith is not a real name pulled from any parish record. It's the name the story has settled on over the years. A stand-in the village uses so the family in question doesn't have to hear their actual name, repeated in every pub from here to Burford. Whether that's out of kindness or simple discretion, nobody's quite sure. But it's worth knowing going in that we are dealing in legend here, not a court transcript. 68 acres of stubborn Cotswold brash, that hard, flinty, unforgiving soil that farmers up near Chipping Norton know rather too well. Barley mostly. A handful of sheep that existed more out of habit than profit, the way sheep tend to on farms where the real money was always meant to come from the arable ground instead. Harold's father had farmed it, his father before him. There is a photograph in the telling that still hangs above the range in the farmhouse kitchen. 3 generations of Beckwith men squinting into the sun, standing in front of the same gate that is still there today, paint peeling in exactly the same place it always has. It is not by the standards of the neighbouring estates a grand place. No follies, no lake, no portrait gallery of ancestors in oils, just a farmhouse with a crooked chimney that's needed repointing since the Thatcher years, a Dutch barn with a roof that had seen better decades, and land that had fed a family through 2 world wars, a great many bad harvests, and at least one summer so wet the wheat simply gave up and lay down in the mud. But land like that does not run on sentiment. It runs on machinery that breaks at the worst possible moment, on fertiliser that costs more every spring than it did the last, on a bank manager somewhere in Oxford who has never once stood in a field at 5 in the morning, in the sleet, but who nonetheless holds the paperwork that decides whether you keep doing so for another season. Harold had borrowed against the farm in the 90s, the way a great many small farmers did, to buy a combine he genuinely needed and couldn't otherwise afford. He had been paying it down ever since, a little every harvest, the way his father had taught him, patiently, doggedly, the way you chip away at a debt you fully intended to outlive. And then, as it does out here, more often than the government likes to admit in its glossy rural strategy papers, the wheel simply stopped turning. 2 bad harvests in a row. A wet summer that rotted half the barley in the ground before it could even be cut. A wife's illness that ate through what savings remained, the way illness always does, quietly and completely, leaving nothing for anyone to argue with. By the spring, the letters had stopped being polite. They'd stopped using the word understand and started using the word require. By September, there was a date circled on a calendar in a solicitor's office in Oxford, a date that meant nothing to the solicitor and everything to the family it belonged to. And by the first week of October, a printed notice had gone up outside the farm gate, cable tied to the same bars 3 generations of Beckwith men had leaned on. The kind of notice that turns a family's entire life into a line item in someone else's accounts. The village knew, of course. Villages always know. And in a place like that, where everyone's grandfather farmed everyone else's grandfather's neighbouring field, where the church register still lists half the surnames on the pub quiz team, a farm going under the hammer is not gossip. It is grief, dressed up as an event with a start time printed on a laminated sheet. The morning of the auction, the lane up to Hold Farm was never built for the traffic it got. Land Rovers mostly. A scattering of Volvo estates belonging to people who'd driven over from 3 villages away simply to stand in solidarity. Hands in pockets, not bidding on anything, just being present, the way the countryside still occasionally insists on being present for its own, even when there's nothing practical it can actually do. There was a coffee urn on a trestle table by the barn, run by the vicar's wife, because apparently that's simply what happens in Oxfordshire when something terrible is scheduled to occur at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday. Nobody had organised it. It had simply appeared, the way these things do here, along with a plate of shortbread nobody quite had the appetite for. Harold stood by his own back door in a jacket that had clearly been ironed for the occasion, which was somehow the most heartbreaking detail of all. A man dressing smartly for the morning, he lost everything, as though good manners were the last thing left that was entirely his to control. His daughter stood beside him, not touching him, because some grief does not want to be touched, it only wants company, and she gave him exactly that. The auctioneer set up on the tailgate of a Land Rover Defender, because of course it was a Defender. This is the Cotswolds, and even Ruin arrives here with a certain amount of taste, and read out the lot in the flat, practiced voice of a man who has done this rather too many times this particular year already. 68 acres, farmhouse, outbuildings, machinery is listed. He read it the way you read something you've stopped letting yourself feel, because feeling it every single time would be unbearable. And there, at the very back of the yard, leaning against a gatepost with his arms folded, was a man in wraparound sunglasses and a wax jacket that had clearly been through worse weather than this. He wasn't talking to anyone, he wasn't being introduced to anyone. He'd simply arrived at some point that morning, without ceremony, and taken up a position where he could see everything and be seen by no one in particular, which, if you know anything about the man this story is usually attached to, is itself rather suspicious. Understatement has never historically been his strongest suit. Nobody in the yard recognised him yet. Give it 20 minutes. There is an unwritten rule at farm auctions like this one, and it is older than any of the people standing in that yard. You do not bid against a neighbour on his own front lawn, not while his family is standing there watching you do it. It is the sort of rule that has never needed writing down, because breaking it would mean never being welcome in that pub again. And rural England has a memory considerably longer than most cities ever manage. So when the auctioneer opened the bidding, the yard did what English yards do in that situation. It looked at its boots. It studied the middle distance with tremendous interest. Nobody local raised a hand. And then a voice came from a man in a very sharp overcoat standing near the front. Nobody's neighbour, nobody's anything. A man who had driven up from London that morning on behalf of a firm that had, according to the muttering that went around the yard afterwards, been quietly buying up small Cotswold farms all year. Cheap, one at a time. The way certain outfits do when they've worked out that planning permission on agricultural land 20 years from now is worth considerably more than the barley currently growing on it. He offered a figure. Low. Insultingly low. The kind of figure that covers the bank's debt and leaves the family with essentially nothing to show for 41 years of 5 o'clock starts. The auctioneer, to his credit, hesitated before repeating it, the way a decent man hesitates before saying something he knows will land badly. Harold's daughter's hand found her father's arm and stayed there. And that was the moment. In the version everyone in the village swears is true, though nobody can quite agree on the exact wording, because good stories get sanded smooth in the retelling, that the man by the gatepost pushed his sunglasses up onto his head and said in a voice that half the yard suddenly, simultaneously, recognised, "That seems a bit stingy, if I'm honest." There was a pause, the kind of pause a village remembers for years. The coffee urn, by all accounts, briefly stopped pouring itself. "Sorry, who are you?" said the auctioneer, not unreasonably. "Just a chap who likes this bit of countryside," came the reply. "Carry on, I'll bid when it's worth bidding." If you know the reputation the man in this story is generally attached to, and by this point, most of the yard had worked it out, because there are not many other men in England who own a wax jacket, a Range Rover, and a face that famous all at the same time, then you will not be terribly surprised by what came next. He did not bid low. He did not bid politely. He bid the way, by all reports, he does most things, with a slightly theatrical enjoyment of watching the other man's face change with every raise of his hand. The London firm's man raised his figure. The gatepost man matched it, then raised it again, without so much as glancing at the auctioneer, the way a man bids when the number genuinely does not concern him, and hasn't for some time. 10,000 became 15. 15 became 22. Somewhere around the mid-20s, the London man's phone rang, and he had a short, tense conversation with someone who was very clearly not authorising him to go any higher, his voice dropping to that particular, urgent whisper. Men in overcoats reserved for calls they'd rather the crowd not overhear. He folded, the way men in sharp overcoats tend to when the number stops making commercial sense and starts making a point instead. The yard by this point had gone almost entirely silent. Even the vicar's wife had stopped pouring coffee. Somewhere near the barn, a dog that had been barking at nothing all morning apparently sensed the shift in the air and stopped too. If you're watching this and you've ever stood in a farmyard, your own, or a neighbour's, or your grandfather's, watching something that mattered hang in the balance on a stranger's raised hand, then you already know exactly the feeling I'm describing here. That particular held breath. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from today, because I promise you, this story reaches further than Oxfordshire ever expected it to. And while you're there, if this channel is your sort of thing, do hit subscribe, tap the little bell, and give this one a like before we get to how it ends. It genuinely helps more than you'd think, and there is a great deal more of Britain's old stories still to tell. Here the story splits, depending on who in the village you ask. This is where legend always gets untidy, and I rather like that it does. Some say he paid the full amount there and then, in a cheque written on the tailgate of the Defender, using his own knee as a desk, the wind trying to take the chequebook out of his hands the whole time. Some say he insisted the deed go back into Harold's name, outright. No strings, no mortgage, nothing. Simply handed the farm back to the family it had always belonged to, and told the solicitor to sort the paperwork out, however was legally tidiest, as though the details were an inconvenience beneath his notice, compared to the principle of the thing. Some say, and this is the detail that always gets a laugh in the retelling, that he then spent a full 20 minutes inspecting Harold's ancient, rust-spotted combine with what several witnesses described as genuine worrying enthusiasm, poking at the header and asking questions nobody there could quite answer, before asking whether Harold might ever consider growing barley good enough for brewing. That last detail is at least entirely consistent with a man whose farm 40 miles down the road grows precisely that. Anyone who has followed his actual, well-documented ventures over the last several years knows the pattern by now. A brewery built from scratch in Oxfordshire, using barley grown within a handful of miles of the farm. Not the cheapest barley the commodity markets could offer, but barley bought at a fair price from local growers who otherwise had no real choice but to accept whatever the wholesalers felt like paying that season. A farm shop that limits its own stock to whatever can be sourced within 16 miles, by policy, by choice, because the man behind it decided that mattered more than convenience or margin. A piece he once wrote for a national newspaper, arguing with more conviction than most financial columnists ever manage, that land was a better investment than any bank could offer, because governments don't get a penny of it when you die, and the price of food only ever goes one way. Whether or not he really stood in that yard near Chipping Norton on that particular October morning, the sentiment behind the story is not invented out of nothing. It is, if anything, rather understated compared to what the man has actually done in full public view, with cameras rolling, for the better part of a decade, buying land nobody else wanted, employing people the cities had stopped noticing, and insisting loudly and often, on television and in print, that the countryside is worth more than the spreadsheets say it is. Perhaps that's exactly why the story took root in the first place, and why it's survived long enough to be told in this pub and that one, year after year. Villages don't generally invent legends about strangers. They invent them about people whose character already fits the shape of the tale being told about them. So, did it happen exactly the way the story tells it? Nobody in Chipping Norton will show you a receipt. There is no framed deed on a farmhouse wall this time. No photograph of two women holding a piece of paper on a porch step. Nothing you could put behind glass and point to. Just a pub, a handful of witnesses who all tell it slightly differently, depending on how many pints in they are, and a farm that, as far as anyone can establish, is still very much in the Beckwith family's hands to this day. What we do know, what is not folklore, what is simply fact, printed in accounts and annual reports and interviews on the public record, is that the man this story has attached itself to has spent the last several years doing, quietly and repeatedly, and at genuine financial risk to himself, precisely the sort of thing this story imagines him doing in one dramatic morning. Buying land other people had given up on, paying local growers fairly when he didn't strictly have to, standing in muddy fields in front of cameras and council planning committees alike, defending an industry that most of Britain had quietly stopped thinking about at all. Maybe the yard at Hold Farm never happened. Maybe there was no Harold, hypothetical name or otherwise, and no cheque written on a knee in the October wind. But somewhere in Oxfordshire, in 100 smaller, less dramatic, far less cinematic ways, that particular morning has been happening for years, one fair price and one guaranteed contract at a time. And that, more than anything else, is very probably why the story survives at all. If a tale like that is the kind of thing that keeps you coming back to this corner of the internet, then you are exactly the sort of viewer we make these for. We tell the stories of British land, British families, and the rather stubborn, rather magnificent people who refuse to let either one go quietly. Whether that story comes from a courthouse deed in 1958 or a farmyard in the Cotswolds that may or may not exist quite the way the pub tells it. Do subscribe if you haven't already and tap that notification bell so you don't miss where we go next. Drop a comment and tell me, do you think a story like this has to be entirely true to be entirely worth telling? I'd genuinely love to know what you think. Thank you, as ever, for spending this time with us. We'll see you in the next one.